The rain hammered against the windows of the small apartment like angry fists, each drop carrying the weight of Sarah Martinez's exhaustion. She had been working double shifts at the diner for 3 weeks straight, trying to scrape together enough money for her daughter's school supplies, and the rent that was already 2 weeks overdue. The fluorescent light in the kitchen flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across the peeling wallpaper that she had promised herself she would replace someday when things got better. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, and 8-year-old Emma had been asleep for hours. The little girl had asked again that evening why they couldn't afford the field trip to the science museum that her classmates were going on. Sarah had given her the same gentle smile and promised they would do something special together instead, but the guilt gnawed at her insides like a persistent ache. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, and despite the court order, her ex-husband Marcus had stopped sending child support payments almost immediately. His lawyer had found loopholes, delays, and excuses that stretched on indefinitely while Sarah struggled to keep their heads above water. She had taken a job at Murphy's Diner because it was walking distance from Emma's school, and the hours were flexible enough that she could be there when her daughter needed her. Tonight had been particularly brutal. The dinner rush had lasted until nearly 10 o'clock, with an endless stream of demanding customers and a kitchen that seemed determined to break down at the worst possible moments. Her feet ached in her worn-out sneakers, and her back protested every movement as she finished cleaning the last of the dishes. Old Murphy had muttered something about business being slow and how he might need to cut hours, which sent a chill of fear through Sarah's already anxious mind. She had just finished counting her tips for the evening when she heard the sound that would change everything. The front door of their ground-floor apartment rattled violently, followed by the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized someone was breaking down their door. The apartment building was in one of the rougher neighborhoods in the city, where break-ins were common enough that most residents had given up calling the police unless someone was actually hurt. The landlord had promised to install better security systems for months, but like most of his promises, it had been forgotten as soon as the words left his mouth. Sarah had often worried about their safety, especially as a single mother, but she had never imagined that her worst fears would become reality on this dark, rain-soaked night. 3 men burst through the damaged door, their faces covered with dark bandanas, and their eyes wild with a mixture of desperation and chemical-induced aggression. The leader was tall and lean, with tattoos covering his arms and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His 2 companions were younger, probably in their early 20s, but their movements were jerky and unpredictable in a way that suggested they were high on something powerful and dangerous. Sarah's first instinct was to scream, but the sound caught in her throat as she saw the gun in the leader's hand. It was a black pistol that gleamed dully in the flickering kitchen light, and the way he held it told her that this was not his first time threatening someone with a weapon. Her mind raced through her options, but with Emma sleeping just down the hallway, running was not a possibility. The leader stepped forward, his voice low and threatening as he spoke. His accent suggested he was local, probably someone who had grown up in the same neighborhood, but had taken a different path than the working families who still called it home. His eyes were bloodshot and constantly moving, scanning the apartment for anything of value while keeping the gun trained on Sarah's chest. The apartment was small and cramped, with secondhand furniture that Sarah had carefully selected from thrift stores and garage sales. The walls were covered with Emma's artwork and photographs from better times when Sarah had been married and they had lived in a house with a yard where Emma could play safely. Now, everything she owned could fit in this tiny space, and even that felt like too much luxury when she struggled to pay the bills each month. The intruders moved through the apartment with practiced efficiency, pulling out drawers and overturning furniture in their search for anything valuable. Sarah's purse, which contained the evening's tips and her last $20 bill, was the first thing they found. The leader tucked it into his jacket without even counting the contents, his attention already focused on finding bigger prizes. The second man, who had a nervous twitch that made his left eye flutter constantly, found Sarah's laptop computer on the kitchen table. It was an old machine that she had bought used to help Emma with her homework, but to these men, it represented easy money at a pawn shop. They wrapped the cord around it carelessly, not caring that they were taking away one of Emma's few connections to the outside world. As they continued their search, Sarah found herself thinking about the events that had led to this moment. The divorce had been devastating, not just emotionally, but financially. Marcus had been a construction supervisor with a good income, and Sarah had worked part-time as a dental assistant. Together, they had been able to afford a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, but when the marriage fell apart, everything had crumbled. The custody battle had drained what little savings they had, and when Marcus decided he didn't want to pay child support, Sarah had been left to fend for herself. She had applied for government assistance, but the bureaucracy moved slowly, and the amount she received barely covered groceries. The job at the diner paid minimum wage plus tips, which on a good week might total $300, but it was nowhere near enough to cover rent, utilities, food, and all the other expenses of raising a child alone. The third intruder, who appeared to be the youngest of the group, found a small jewelry box on Sarah's dresser. Inside were her grandmother's pearl earrings, her wedding ring, and a gold necklace that had belonged to her mother. These items had no significant monetary value, but they were the only connection she had left to family members who had passed away. Watching him dump them into a dirty gym bag felt like losing her loved ones all over again. The leader became increasingly agitated as their search continued, without finding anything of real value. He had probably expected to find electronics, cash, drugs, or other items that could be quickly converted to money, but Sarah's poverty meant there was little worth stealing. His frustration was dangerous, and Sarah could see in his eyes that he was beginning to consider other ways to make this break-in profitable. It was then that Emma's voice called out from the hallway, sleepy and confused by the noise that had woken her up. The little girl appeared in the doorway wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with cartoon characters that were starting to fade from too many washings. Her hair was tousled from sleep, and she rubbed her eyes with small fists as she tried to understand what was happening in her home. The sight of her daughter sent a surge of protective rage through Sarah's body that was stronger than any fear she had felt for herself. Emma was innocent and pure, a bright light in Sarah's dark world, and the thought of these violent men hurting her child was unbearable. Sarah stepped forward instinctively, placing herself between the intruders and her daughter, her voice shaking as she begged them not to hurt Emma. The leader's eyes lit up with a cruel intelligence as he realized the significance of the child's presence. He now had leverage that was more powerful than any weapon, something that would ensure Sarah's complete cooperation. He gestured for his companions to continue searching while he focused his attention on the mother and daughter, his gun now pointed directly at Emma's small form. The little girl began to cry, not understanding why these strange men were in their home or why her mother looked so frightened. Sarah knelt down and pulled Emma close, whispering reassurances that she didn't believe herself while her mind raced to find a way out of this nightmare. The smell of her daughter's shampoo and the feeling of those small arms around her neck reminded her of all the reasons she had to survive this encounter. The leader stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could smell the alcohol and tobacco on his breath. His voice was low and menacing as he explained exactly what would happen if she didn't cooperate fully with their demands. The gun in his hand seemed enormous, a piece of black metal that represented the power of life and death over her and her precious daughter. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah found herself studying the leader's face, memorizing every detail in case she survived to identify him later. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and his skin had the grayish pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors and too little time taking care of himself. The scar on his face was old, probably from a knife fight or accident that had happened years ago, but it gave him a sinister appearance that he clearly cultivated. The apartment felt smaller with each passing moment, the walls closing in as the reality of their situation became clear. These were not ordinary burglars looking for a quick score. They were desperate men who had nothing to lose and no qualms about using violence to get what they wanted. Sarah's mind went to her phone, which was charging on the kitchen counter, but it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do her now. Emma's crying had subsided into quiet whimpers, but Sarah could feel the little girl's body trembling with fear against her own. The child's innocence was being shattered by this experience, and Sarah knew that even if they survived, Emma would carry the scars of this night for the rest of her life. The thought filled her with a rage so pure and powerful that it almost overcame her fear. The leader seemed to sense her thoughts, and his smile was cruel as he pressed the gun barrel against Sarah's temple. The metal was cold and hard, a circle of potential death that made every nerve in her body scream with terror. His voice was barely above a whisper as he told her that their night was just beginning, that he had plans for both her and her daughter that would make them wish they had never been born. But what the leader didn't know, what none of them could have guessed from looking at this tired waitress in her stained apron, was that Sarah Martinez had not always been a struggling single mother working for tips. 8 years ago, before Emma was born, before the marriage that had seemed so promising, Sarah had been Petty Officer First Class Sarah Chun of the United States Navy SEALs. The training had been the hardest thing she had ever endured, months of physical and mental challenges that had pushed her to the very limits of human endurance. She had learned to swim in freezing water for hours, to navigate by the stars, to remain calm under pressure that would break most people. Most importantly, she had learned how to kill efficiently and without hesitation when a mission required it. The pregnancy had changed everything, forcing her to choose between the career she had trained for and the family she wanted to build. She had chosen love and motherhood, leaving the Navy to become the wife and mother she thought she was meant to be. But the training never really left, sleeping dormant in her muscle memory and reflexes like a weapon waiting to be drawn. As the gun pressed harder against her skull and the leader's breath became more excited, Sarah felt something ancient and deadly awakening inside her. The helpless victim these men thought they were terrorizing was about to show them exactly why you should never threaten a Navy SEAL, even one disguised as a tired waitress who just wanted to protect her child. The rain continued to pound against the windows as Sarah's transformation began, her body shifting almost imperceptibly as years of training overrode months of civilian life. Emma, still pressed against her mother's chest, would later say that something had changed in her mother's heartbeat, becoming slower and more regular, like the steady rhythm of a machine preparing for action. The leader was still talking, still making his threats and demands, completely unaware that he had just made the biggest mistake of his criminal career. In the flickering light of the kitchen, with her daughter's life hanging in the balance, Sarah began to calculate distances, angles, and the precise sequence of movements that would end this threat once and for all. The night was about to become much more dangerous, but not for the reasons any of them expected. The transformation began in Sarah's breathing. Where moments before her chest had been rising and falling in the panicked rhythm of a terrified mother, now her respirations became deep and controlled, each breath drawing oxygen to muscles that were remembering their true purpose. The change was so subtle that even Emma, pressed against her mother's chest, only sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the woman who held her. Sarah's eyes, which had been wide with fear just seconds earlier, now began to narrow as they cataloged every detail of the apartment with tactical precision. The kitchen knife block was 18 inches to her left, containing a set of cheap but sharp blades that her ex-husband had bought during their brief attempt at cooking together. The heavy cast-iron skillet that hung from a hook near the stove could serve as both weapon and shield. The coffee table's glass top would shatter into useful shards with the right amount of pressure applied at the correct angle. The leader continued his verbal assault, his voice growing more confident as he interpreted Sarah's stillness as submission. He had no way of knowing that in military operations, the moment before action was always marked by an almost supernatural calm, the quiet before the storm that would reshape everything in its path. His gun remained pressed against her temple, but what he thought was a symbol of his complete control was actually providing her with crucial intelligence about his position and likely reactions. Through her training, Sarah had learned to compartmentalize fear, to put it in a mental box where it couldn't interfere with the mission at hand. The mission now was simple and clear: neutralize the threats and protect Emma. Everything else was irrelevant. The bills she couldn't pay, the job she might lose, the uncertain future that had been keeping her awake at night. All of it faded into background noise as her mind shifted into the operational mode she hadn't accessed in nearly a decade. The tallest intruder, the one with a nervous twitch, was standing near the window, approximately 8 feet away. His body language suggested he was the least experienced of the three, probably brought along as backup muscle rather than tactical expertise. His hands shook slightly as he held a crowbar that he had picked up from somewhere, and his eyes kept darting toward the door as if he was already planning his escape route. He would be the easiest to neutralize, but also the most unpredictable in his panic. The third man, younger and more compact, had positioned himself near the hallway that led to the bedrooms. His stance was more professional, suggesting some military or law enforcement background that had gone wrong somewhere along the way. He carried himself like someone who had been in dangerous situations before, but there was still an amateur quality to the way he held his weapon, a knife that looked like it had been purchased at a gas station rather than earned through legitimate training. Sarah's muscles began to remember sequences they hadn't performed in years. Her legs, which had been carrying her through 12-hour shifts at the diner, recalled how to generate explosive power from a crouched position. Her hands, which had been serving coffee and wiping tables, remembered the precise grip and leverage points that could disable an armed opponent before he could react. Her neck and shoulders, which had been aching from the stress of single motherhood, realigned themselves into the perfect posture for maximum efficiency of movement. The leader was still talking, weaving a narrative of threats and demands that he believed would break her spirit completely. He spoke of things he would do to her daughter, violations and violence that were designed to strip away her humanity and reduce her to a compliant victim. But each word only served to fuel the cold fire that was building in Sarah's core, the righteous fury of a protector who had been pushed beyond the breaking point. Emma's breathing had steadied against her mother's chest, and Sarah could feel the little girl's complete trust in her ability to make everything okay. This was the source of her power, not anger or hatred, but love so pure and fierce that it could overcome any obstacle. Her daughter believed in her absolutely, and that faith was more powerful than any weapon these men could carry. The apartment itself became Sarah's ally as her tactical awareness expanded to encompass every inch of the space. The loose floorboard near the bathroom door that squeaked when stepped on could serve as an early warning system. The heavy bookshelf that Marcus had insisted on anchoring to the wall could provide cover or become a crushing weapon if toppled correctly. Even the flickering light, which had been an annoyance just minutes before, now became a tactical advantage that would make her movements harder to track. Years of living in this neighborhood had taught Sarah the rhythms of the building and the street outside. Mrs. Rodriguez upstairs would be watching her evening telenovela with the volume turned up high enough to wake the dead. The Johnsons in the apartment next door were both heavy sleepers who wouldn't hear anything short of an explosion. The police response time to this area averaged 17 minutes on a good night, and with the rain, it would be longer. She was completely on her own, which was exactly how she had been trained to operate. The leader's mistake came when he shifted his grip on the gun to gesture more dramatically with his free hand. For just a moment, the pressure of the barrel against her temple lessened, and Sarah felt rather than saw the slight change in angle that would make her next move possible. Her body was already coiling like a spring, every muscle fiber preparing for the explosive sequence that would begin her counterattack. But first, she needed to create the right conditions for success. Emma was still in her arms, and Sarah's primary objective was to get her daughter to safety before engaging the enemy. The hallway closet had a heavy wooden door and was positioned in a way that would provide some protection from gunfire. If she could get Emma there and barricade it inside, she would have the freedom to do what needed to be done. Sarah's voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and steady in a way that confused the intruders. They had expected pleading or crying, the breakdown of a helpless civilian who had been pushed beyond her limits. Instead, she spoke to Emma in the same gentle tone she used for bedtime stories, telling her daughter that they were going to play a game now, a very important game where Emma needed to be the bravest little girl in the whole world. The leader paused in his monologue, sensing something had changed, but unable to identify exactly what. Sarah used his momentary confusion to gather more intelligence about the room and the positions of all three men. The kitchen clock read 12:47 a.m., which meant they had been in the apartment for approximately 8 minutes. In her military experience, home invasions that lasted longer than 10 minutes usually escalated to violence as the perpetrators became more comfortable and confident in their control. Emma looked up at her mother with eyes that held complete trust, even in this terrifying situation. The little girl had inherited Sarah's intelligence and intuitive understanding of people, and something in her mother's tone told her that this was different from the helplessness they had been feeling just moments before. Sarah whispered instructions that sounded like a game, but were actually a tactical plan, telling Emma exactly where to go and what to do when Mommy gave her the special signal. The leader was becoming impatient with what he perceived as Sarah's attempt to comfort her daughter. His voice grew harsher as he reminded her that he was the one in control, that her little girl's safety depended entirely on her cooperation. He pressed the gun back against her temple with renewed force, not realizing that he was actually providing her with the exact leverage point she needed to begin her attack. Sarah's hands, which had been holding Emma protectively, shifted almost imperceptibly into positions that would allow for maximum striking power. Her left hand remained curved around her daughter's back, but her right hand moved to a spot that would give her access to pressure points on the leader's wrist and forearm. The movement was so natural and motherly that none of the intruders noticed the tactical significance of the change. The rain outside had intensified into a full storm, with thunder beginning to rumble in the distance. The weather would work in her favor, masking the sounds of combat, and making it unlikely that any neighbors would investigate unusual noises. Lightning flashed outside the window, briefly illuminating the scene like a snapshot frozen in time. 3 violent criminals who thought they had found easy victims, a mother holding her child, and the moment before everything changed forever. Sarah's training had included extensive study of criminal psychology and the mindset of predators. These men were operating on the assumption that their victims would remain passive, that the threat of violence would be enough to ensure compliance. They had probably committed similar crimes before, relying on fear and intimidation rather than careful planning or tactical awareness. Their confidence would become their weakness. The youngest intruder was growing restless, his eyes constantly moving between Sarah and the valuables they had already collected. His body language suggested he was ready to leave, having gotten what they came for, but the leader seemed intent on escalating the situation. This division of priorities would create an opportunity for exploitation, as Sarah could use their conflicting goals against them. As another flash of lightning illuminated the apartment, Sarah made her decision. The game of patience and positioning was over. It was time to begin the operation that would end this threat once and for all. Her daughter's life hung in the balance, and failure was not an option. She had been trained by the best military instructors in the world, had faced enemies in foreign lands who were better armed and more experienced than these street criminals, and had never failed a mission when the stakes were this high. The leader opened his mouth to speak again, probably to make another threat or demand, but he would never get the chance to finish a sentence. Sarah's transformation from victim to weapon was complete, and the storm that was about to break inside this small apartment would make the weather outside seem like a gentle spring rain. In the split second before she moved, Sarah's mind cataloged every detail of what was about to happen. The sequence of movements that would disarm the leader, the follow-up strikes that would neutralize the other 2 threats, the path to get Emma to safety, and the final actions that would ensure none of these men could ever threaten another family. It was all there in her mind like a choreographed dance, each step flowing naturally into the next. The little girl in her arms would later say that her mother's heartbeat changed one more time in that final moment, not faster or slower, but different somehow, like the steady rhythm of someone who knew exactly what they were going to do and was completely prepared to do it. Emma would remember that sound for the rest of her life, the heartbeat of a warrior preparing to protect what she loved most in the world. The leader's finger was on the trigger, his threats becoming more specific and disturbing when Sarah finally made her move. The transformation from helpless victim to deadly operative happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next, faster than thought, more sudden than lightning, and completely without warning. What happened in the next few seconds would become the stuff of neighborhood legend, whispered about in the corner grocery store and discussed in hushed tones by police officers who thought they had seen everything. But in that moment, all that mattered were the mother's love and the skills that would ensure her daughter lived to see another day. The first movement was so fast that the human eye could barely follow it. Sarah's right hand snapped upward like a striking serpent, her fingers finding the precise nerve cluster on the leader's wrist that would cause his hand to involuntarily open. The technique, called a radial nerve strike, was something she had practiced 10,000 times during her Navy training, first on practice dummies, then on fellow trainees who wore protective gear, and finally in real combat situations where the stakes were life and death. The gun fell from the leader's suddenly paralyzed fingers, clattering to the floor with a metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the small apartment. His face registered complete shock as his brain tried to process what had just happened. One moment he had been in complete control, holding a loaded weapon to a helpless woman's head, and the next moment he was staring at his own useless hand as if it belonged to someone else. Sarah didn't pause to admire her handiwork. In the same fluid motion that had disarmed the leader, she spun Emma toward the hallway closet with gentle but irresistible force. The little girl, who had been coached in this moment, ran towards safety without looking back, her small feet pattering across the worn carpet as she followed her mother's instructions exactly. The closet door slammed shut behind her with a sound that meant one less person Sarah needed to protect during what was about to happen. The leader's shock lasted exactly 1.3 seconds. Sarah's training had taught her to count time automatically during combat operations. That was all the time he needed to realize that his easy victim had somehow transformed into something far more dangerous than he had bargained for. His uninjured hand reached toward the knife on his belt, but Sarah was already inside his defensive perimeter, too close for him to draw the blade effectively. Her left elbow drove upward into his solar plexus with enough force to lift his feet off the ground. The strike was precisely calculated to cause maximum pain and disorientation without killing him, not out of mercy, but because a dead enemy couldn't provide information about who had sent them or whether there were others coming. The leader's breath exploded out of his lungs in a whoosh that would have been audible 3 apartments away, if not for the thunder that chose that exact moment to crash overhead. The tallest intruder, the one with the nervous twitch, finally overcame his paralysis and swung his crowbar towards Sarah's head. His technique was clumsy, telegraphed by his shoulders and hips in a way that gave her plenty of time to react. She ducked under the swing and came up behind him, her arms snaking around his throat in a blood choke that would render him unconscious in approximately 6 seconds if applied correctly. But the man was stronger than he looked, and desperation gave him enough adrenaline to break her initial hold. He spun around with the crowbar, forcing Sarah to release him and step back to avoid having her ribs crushed. The confined space of the apartment was working against her now, limiting her mobility and giving the intruders some advantage in close quarters combat. The third man, the one who had been positioned near the hallway, was smarter than his companions. Instead of rushing directly into the fight, he was moving toward the closet where Emma was hiding. Sarah's tactical assessment instantly recalculated. Protecting her daughter took priority over neutralizing the immediate threats, even if it meant taking risks with her own safety. Sarah grabbed the cast-iron skillet from its hook near the stove and sent it flying toward the man approaching the closet. The heavy pan caught him in the shoulder with enough force to spin him around and send him crashing into the wall. But he maintained his grip on his knife and was already starting to recover, which meant she had perhaps 3 seconds before he became a threat to Emma again. The leader was beginning to breathe normally again, his hands slowly regaining feeling as the effects of the nerve strike wore off. Sarah could see him eyeing the gun that had fallen near the refrigerator, calculating whether he could reach it before she could stop him. The kitchen knife block was closer to her position, but moving toward it would put her back to the man with the crowbar, who was already raising his weapon for another swing. Time seemed to slow as Sarah's training took complete control of her actions. She had been taught to fight multiple opponents in confined spaces, to prioritize threats based on capability and positioning, and to use environmental factors to her advantage. The apartment that had seemed so small and cramped when she was a victim now became a tactical playground where every object was a potential weapon. The coffee table's glass top shattered under her boot heel, sending sharp fragments across the floor that would make footing treacherous for anyone not wearing shoes. The 3 intruders were all in sneakers or boots, but Sarah was barefoot and had automatically adjusted her stance to account for the hazard she had just created. Years of beach training had taught her to fight effectively on unstable or dangerous surfaces. Lightning flashed again outside the window, and in that strobe light moment, the apartment looked like a freeze frame from an action movie. The leader was diving toward his gun, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. The tall man with the crowbar was bringing his weapon down in an arc that would have split her skull if it connected. The third man was pulling himself up from the wall, his knife held in a grip that suggested he knew how to use it effectively. Sarah moved like water, flowing between the attacks with grace that seemed almost supernatural. She caught the crowbar on its downward swing, using the attacker's own momentum to redirect the weapon into the leader's back just as he reached for his gun. The impact sent both men crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs and, cursing, temporarily neutralizing 2 of her 3 opponents. But the third man was already behind her, his knife slicing through the air toward her ribs in a thrust that would have punctured her lung if she hadn't sensed it coming. Her combat awareness had expanded to encompass the entire room, tracking movement and sound and even the subtle changes in air pressure that announced an attack. She spun away from the blade and grabbed his wrist, applying a joint lock that sent the knife spinning away into the darkness. The man screamed as his wrist bent at an impossible angle, the bones grinding against each other in a way that would require surgery to repair properly. Sarah held the lock for just long enough to ensure he wouldn't be picking up any weapons with that hand again, then released him and stepped back to reassess the tactical situation. The apartment was in chaos now, furniture overturned and glass scattered across the floor like dangerous stars. The leader was trying to push his dazed companion off of him while reaching for his gun with fingers that still weren't working properly. The tall man with the crowbar was groaning and holding his back where the redirected weapon had struck his spine. The third man was cradling his broken wrist and backing toward the door, his eyes wide with the realization that they had made a terrible mistake. But Sarah wasn't done with them yet. These men had broken into her home, threatened her daughter, and tried to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. They had seen Emma's face and knew where they lived, which meant they would always be a potential threat as long as they were free to walk the streets. Her military training had taught her that neutralizing an enemy meant making sure they could never threaten you or your mission again. The leader finally managed to get his hand around the gun, but his grip was still weak from the nerve damage, and Sarah was already moving. She kicked the weapon across the room, sending it sliding under the couch where none of them could reach it easily. Her follow-up strike caught him in the temple, and his eyes rolled back as he dropped into unconsciousness. The tall man was trying to stand up, using his crowbar as a crutch, but his legs weren't working properly after the impact to his spine. Sarah evaluated him and determined that he was no longer an immediate threat. He might walk again eventually, but he wouldn't be breaking into anyone's home for a very long time. The third man, the one with the broken wrist, was almost at the door when Sarah spoke for the first time since the fight had begun. Her voice was calm and conversational, as if she was discussing the weather rather than addressing a criminal who had just threatened her family. She asked him if he really thought he was going to leave without answering some questions first. The man stopped moving toward the door, not because he wanted to, but because something in Sarah's tone told him that trying to run would be a very bad idea. He turned around slowly, his uninjured hand raised in a gesture of surrender, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. This wasn't how home invasions were supposed to go. They had picked what looked like an easy target, a single mother working a minimum wage job, and somehow ended up in a situation that felt more like a military operation than a simple robbery. Sarah's breathing was still controlled and steady despite the intense physical activity. Her heart rate had elevated during the combat, but it was already returning to normal as her body processed the adrenaline efficiently. This was the result of conditioning that had been drilled into her during countless hours of training, preparation for situations exactly like this one, where staying calm meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The apartment was quiet now, except for the sound of rain against the windows and the groaning of the two men on the floor. Sarah moved to the closet and spoke softly to Emma, telling her daughter that the bad men couldn't hurt them anymore, but that she needed to stay hidden just a little bit longer while Mommy finished taking care of things. The little girl's voice was muffled but steady as she promised to be brave and wait for the all-clear signal. Sarah turned her attention back to the man with the broken wrist, her eyes studying his face with the same intensity she had once used to memorize terrorist profiles in classified briefings. She was going to find out who these men were, who had sent them, and whether there were others who might threaten her family. The interrogation phase of the operation was about to begin, and she had been trained by experts in extracting information from unwilling subjects. The storm outside was reaching its peak, with lightning flashing almost continuously and thunder shaking the windows in their frames. But inside the small apartment, a different kind of storm was just getting started. Sarah Martinez, tired waitress and struggling single mother, had temporarily stepped aside to let Petty Officer Chun handle the situation. And Petty Officer Chun had questions that needed answers before this night was over. The man with the broken wrist was about to learn that threatening a Navy SEAL's family was a mistake that carried consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. The real fight was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The man with the broken wrist slumped against the doorframe, his face pale with shock and pain. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool night air that was seeping through the damaged front door, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Sarah could read his vital signs as clearly as if he were connected to medical monitors. He was going to mild shock from the trauma and blood loss, but he would remain conscious and coherent for quite some time yet. Sarah pulled one of the kitchen chairs into the center of the room, positioning it so that she had clear sight lines to all entrances and could monitor the two unconscious men while conducting her questioning. Her movements were economical and precise, every action serving a specific tactical purpose. She had learned these techniques during advanced interrogation training at a classified facility in Virginia, where the instructors had been former CIA operatives with decades of field experience. The chair creaked as she gestured for the injured man to sit, but her tone remained conversational and almost friendly. This was psychological warfare at its most refined level, keeping the subject off balance by alternating between apparent concern for his welfare and subtle reminders of what she was capable of doing to him. The broken wrist was just a preview of the damage she could inflict if he chose not to cooperate. As the man lowered himself gingerly into the chair, Sarah began her assessment of him as a source of intelligence. He appeared to be in his early 20s, with the lean build and nervous energy of someone who survived on the streets through a combination of desperation and small-time criminal activity. His clothing was clean but worn, suggesting he wasn't completely homeless, but wasn't making much money from his illegal activities either. The tattoos on his visible skin told a story of gang affiliations and prison time. Sarah's training had included gang identification protocols, and she could read the symbols and placement like a resume written in ink and scar tissue. The teardrop under his left eye indicated he had killed someone, probably during his teenage years. The spider web on his elbow meant he had served time in county jail. The numbers tattooed across his knuckles were coordinates, not geographical, but personal markers that identified him to other members of his criminal organization. What interested Sarah most was what she didn't see. There were no military tattoos, no prison gang symbols that would indicate serious organized crime connections, no evidence of drug addiction or the kind of desperation that drove people to truly violent crimes. This was a small-time criminal who had gotten in over his head, which meant he was likely to break under questioning if she applied the right pressure. She began with basic information gathering, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of someone conducting a routine interview. Name, age, address, how long he had been living in the area. Simple questions that established a pattern of compliance before moving on to more sensitive topics. The man answered reluctantly at first, then, with increasing cooperation as his survival instincts kicked in. His name was Derek Morales, and he was 23 years old. He had been living in a halfway house about 6 miles from Sarah's apartment building, part of a rehabilitation program for offenders who were transitioning back into society after serving their sentences. This information immediately raised red flags in Sarah's mind. Halfway house residents were closely monitored and had strict curfews that should have prevented them from being out at this time of night. As Derek's story unfolded, Sarah began to piece together a picture that was more complex than a simple home invasion. The 3 men hadn't chosen her apartment randomly. They had been given specific information about her work schedule, her financial situation, and the layout of the building. Someone had been watching her family for weeks, gathering intelligence, and planning this operation with a level of detail that suggested professional criminal involvement. The leader, who was still unconscious on the floor, was identified as Carlos Vega, a career criminal with connections to several drug trafficking organizations. Derek claimed he didn't know much about Carlos's background, but his body language suggested he was lying. Sarah's training had taught her to read microexpressions and unconscious physical tells that revealed deception, and Derek was displaying several classic indicators. She shifted her approach, becoming more direct in her questioning while maintaining the same calm, conversational tone. Military interrogators had taught her that escalation of pressure should be gradual and psychological rather than physical. The threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself, especially when the subject had already witnessed what the interrogator was capable of doing. The third man, the tall one with the crowbar who was now groaning softly as consciousness returned, was apparently named Tommy Rodriguez. Derek's description painted him as muscle for hire, someone who was brought in for jobs that required intimidation rather than skill. His nervous twitch and unprofessional handling of the crowbar had already suggested that he was the weak link in the group, someone who could probably be turned against his accomplices if the right pressure was applied. But it was Derek's reluctance to discuss how they had obtained information about Sarah's family that told her she was dealing with something more serious than a random crime. Home invaders didn't typically conduct surveillance operations or gather detailed intelligence about their targets. This suggested organized crime involvement, possibly related to witness intimidation or debt collection, which meant there might be others coming. Sarah's questions became more pointed as she probed for information about who had hired them and why her family had been targeted specifically. Derek's answers became increasingly evasive, and she could see the fear in his eyes growing stronger. He was more afraid of whoever had sent them than he was of her, which told her that the real threat to her family's safety was still out there somewhere. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, providing natural sound masking for their conversation. Sarah was grateful for the weather. If any neighbors had heard the sounds of the fight, they would have dismissed it as thunder or attributed it to the television programs that were always playing too loud in the building. The last thing she needed was police involvement before she had extracted all the information she needed. Tommy was starting to move more purposefully on the floor. His back injury, apparently less severe than Sarah had initially assessed. She kept one eye on him while continuing to question Derek, ready to take action if either of the injured men became a threat again. Carlos remained unconscious, but his breathing was strong and regular, which meant he would probably wake up soon with nothing worse than a severe headache. Derek finally began to break under the sustained pressure of her questioning. The information came out in fragments at first, then in a flood as his resistance crumbled completely. The job hadn't been a random burglary after all. They had been hired to send a message to someone, to demonstrate that no one was beyond the reach of their employer's influence. Sarah was just collateral damage in someone else's war. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her ex-husband Marcus had apparently gotten involved with people who used violence to collect debts and enforce agreements. The child support payments he had been avoiding weren't just a domestic matter. They were connected to money he owed to dangerous individuals who had decided that threatening his family was an effective way to motivate him to pay his obligations. This changed everything. Sarah had been assuming that neutralizing the immediate threats would end the danger to her family. But if Derek was telling the truth, these three men were just the beginning. There would be others, and they would keep coming until Marcus either paid what he owed or disappeared permanently. Her daughter would never be safe as long as the situation remained unresolved. The implications were staggering. Marcus had essentially painted a target on his own daughter's back through his involvement with criminals. Whether he had borrowed money, failed to pay for drugs, or reneged on some other illegal agreement didn't matter. The result was that Emma was now considered leverage in a game that could get her killed. Sarah's military training had included scenarios where family members were threatened by terrorist organizations or enemy combatants. The standard protocol was immediate extraction and relocation, getting the threatened individuals to a secure location where they could be protected until the threat was eliminated. But that required resources and support networks that weren't available to a civilian single mother working at a diner. Derek continued to provide information, apparently hoping that cooperation would earn him some mercy when the police arrived. He gave her names, addresses, and details about the criminal organization that had hired them. Most importantly, he confirmed that this had been intended as a warning rather than a killing. They were supposed to rough up Sarah and Emma just enough to demonstrate that Marcus's family was vulnerable, then leave them alive to deliver the message. The fact that the plan had gone so wrong would probably anger their employers, which meant the next team sent to deal with the situation would be more professional and better prepared. Derek estimated that they would have perhaps 48 to 72 hours before someone came looking for Carlos and his team, and when they found out what had happened, the response would be swift and violent. Tommy was now sitting up against the wall, his hand pressed to his lower back, and his face twisted with pain. He had been listening to Derek's confession, and Sarah could see the fear and anger warring in his expression. He knew as well as she did that Derek had just signed all of their death warrants by revealing so much information to their intended victim. Sarah's mind was already working on the tactical problem of how to protect Emma while dealing with the larger threat. Simply calling the police wouldn't be enough. Even if these three men were arrested and prosecuted, their employers would just send someone else to finish the job. The only permanent solution was to eliminate the threat at its source, which would require taking the fight to people who were far more dangerous than street-level criminals. But first, she needed to secure her immediate area and ensure that Emma remained safe while she developed a longer-term strategy. The apartment was no longer a viable safe house. Too many people knew the location, and the damaged door made it impossible to defend effectively. They would need to relocate immediately before word of the failed operation reached the people who had ordered it. Carlos began to stir, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. Sarah watched him carefully, noting the way his hands moved instinctively toward concealed weapon positions even before he was fully awake. This was someone with extensive combat experience, possibly military or law enforcement background gone wrong, and he would be much more dangerous than his companions once he regained his faculties. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, but Sarah knew that the real tempest was just beginning. She had successfully defended her home and protected her daughter from the immediate threat, but the larger war for their survival was about to begin. The skills that had been dormant for years would need to become active again, and the loving mother would have to make room for the warrior she had once been. Emma's voice called softly from the closet, asking if it was safe to come out yet. Sarah's heart clenched as she realized that her daughter's childhood had effectively ended tonight. They would never again be able to live the simple life of a working mother and her child. From now on, they would be fugitives in their own city, always looking over their shoulders and always ready to run or fight. The choice was simple, but terrible. Surrender to a life of fear and vulnerability, or embrace the violence that would be necessary to keep Emma safe. Sarah had made harder decisions in combat zones overseas, but none had ever felt more personal or carried higher stakes than the one she faced now in her own living room. Derek was still talking, providing more details about the criminal organization and their methods, but Sarah was only half listening now. Her mind was already shifting into operational planning mode, calculating resources, timelines, and target priorities. The mission had changed from defense to offense, and she had work to do before the sun came up. Dawn was breaking over the city as Sarah finished securing the 3 intruders with zip ties she had found in her small toolbox. Carlos had regained consciousness 20 minutes earlier and had tried one last desperate attack, but his coordination was still compromised from the head injury, and Sarah had put him back down with a chokehold that left him unconscious but breathing. The apartment looked like a war zone, with overturned furniture and broken glass scattered across the floor. Emma had finally been allowed out of the closet once Sarah was certain all threats were neutralized. The little girl had been remarkably brave throughout the entire ordeal, following her mother's instructions without question even when she didn't understand what was happening. Now she sat quietly on the couch, clutching her favorite stuffed animal and watching her mother work with eyes that seemed older than her 8 years. Sarah's phone calls had been brief and purposeful. First to 911, reporting a home invasion and requesting police and medical response. Second to her sister Maria in San Diego, arranging for Emma to stay there while Sarah dealt with the larger problem that had put them in danger. Third to a number she hadn't called in 5 years, her former commanding officer, Commander Patricia Hayes, who now ran a private security consulting firm that specialized in protecting high-risk civilians. The police arrived first, led by Detective Robert Shun, an Asian-American veteran who took one look at the scene and immediately understood that this hadn't been a typical home invasion. The precision with which the attackers had been neutralized, the professional restraint shown in applying exactly enough force to control the situation without causing permanent damage. These were the hallmarks of military training rather than civilian self-defense. Detective Chin's questions were thorough, but respectful, and Sarah could tell that he had military experience himself from the way he assessed the tactical aspects of the scene. She provided a carefully edited version of events that focused on protecting her daughter rather than the specific techniques she had used to overcome 3 armed men. The detective's reports would describe a lucky homeowner who had managed to turn the tables on her attackers through quick thinking and desperation. The paramedics arrived shortly after the police, and their assessment confirmed that none of the 3 men had suffered life-threatening injuries. Carlos had a concussion that would require overnight observation. Tommy had pulled muscles in his lower back that would heal with rest, and Derek's broken wrist would need surgical repair, but wasn't complicated. Sarah watched as they were loaded into ambulances, knowing that their arrest would buy her some time, but wouldn't solve the underlying problem. The real conversation happened after the official responders had left. Commander Hayes arrived at the apartment as the crime scene technicians were finishing their work, her presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the room. She was a tall woman in her 50s with silver hair, and the kind of bearing that made it clear she had spent her career making life and death decisions. Her handshake was firm, and her eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the aftermath of the night's events. They spoke in the kitchen while Emma watched cartoons on Sarah's laptop, their voices low and their words chosen carefully. Commander Hayes had contacts throughout law enforcement and intelligence communities, resources that could help track down the criminal organization behind the attack. More importantly, she had safe houses and trained personnel who could protect Emma while Sarah dealt with the threat permanently. The plan that emerged from their conversation was elegant in its simplicity. Emma would be relocated to a secure facility outside the city, guarded by former military personnel who specialized in protecting civilians from organized crime threats. Sarah would work with Commander Hayes' team to identify and eliminate the leadership of the criminal organization that had targeted her family. The message would be clear. Threatening a Navy SEAL's family carried consequences that extended far beyond anything local criminals were prepared to handle. Marcus, Sarah's ex-husband, would also need to be dealt with. Detective Chin's preliminary investigation had already confirmed Derek's story about unpaid debts and criminal associations. Marcus had borrowed money from the wrong people to support a gambling addiction that Sarah hadn't known about during their marriage, and when he couldn't pay them back, they had decided to use his family as leverage. His selfishness had put Emma in mortal danger, and that was something Sarah could never forgive or forget. The conversation with Emma about what would happen next was the hardest part of Sarah's day. She explained that they would need to go away for a while, that some bad people were angry about something Daddy had done, and that Mommy needed to make sure they could never hurt their family again. Emma's questions were heartbreaking in their innocence. Why couldn't they just call the police? Why did they have to leave their home? When would things go back to normal? Sarah answered as honestly as she could, without frightening her daughter more than necessary. Sometimes grown-ups made very bad choices that hurt other people, and when that happened, it was up to the good grown-ups to fix the problems. Emma would stay with Aunt Maria and some new friends who were very good at keeping little girls safe, while Mommy went to take care of the bad people who wanted to hurt their family. It wouldn't take long, and then they could start over somewhere new. The goodbye was temporary, but felt like forever. Sarah held her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and memorizing the feeling of those small arms around her neck. Emma was brave and strong, just like her mother, and she would survive this trauma with the support of family and trained professionals. But Sarah knew that their relationship would never be quite the same after this night. The innocent trust of early childhood had been shattered by the reality of a dangerous world. Commander Hayes' team arrived to collect Emma in an unmarked van with tinted windows, their civilian clothes doing nothing to hide their military bearing. They were kind but professional, explaining to Emma that they were going on a special trip to a place where she could swim and ride horses while Mommy took care of important business. The little girl waved goodbye from the back seat, her stuffed animal clutched tightly in her arms, and Sarah felt a piece of her heart break as they drove away. The apartment felt hollow and strange without Emma's presence. Sarah packed quickly and efficiently, taking only essential items and leaving behind most of the physical reminders of a life she had been trying to build. The furniture could be replaced, the photographs could be reprinted, but the sense of safety and normalcy that had been destroyed couldn't be recovered until the threat was eliminated completely. The criminal organization that had targeted her family operated out of a warehouse district on the other side of the city. Commander Hayes' intelligence network had identified the key players within hours of beginning their investigation. The kind of rapid response that was only possible with resources that extended into law enforcement, military, and intelligence communities. The plan for dealing with them would be implemented over the next 48 hours, with surgical precision and overwhelming force. Sarah's role in the operation would be limited but crucial. Her personal involvement in the original attack gave her legal justification for self-defense actions that might otherwise be difficult to explain. More importantly, her skills and training made her an ideal addition to a team that specialized in dealing with threats too dangerous for conventional law enforcement to handle effectively. The transformation was happening again, but this time it was deliberate and complete. The tired waitress who had been struggling to pay rent and worried about her daughter's school supplies was being put away permanently, replaced by the warrior who had sworn an oath to protect the innocent from those who would do them harm. The Navy SEAL who had been dormant for 8 years was fully awakened now, ready to do whatever was necessary to ensure that Emma could grow up safe and free. As Sarah left the apartment for the last time, she looked back at the place where she had tried so hard to build a normal life for herself and her daughter. The broken door had been temporarily secured with plywood, but it would probably never be properly repaired. Like her old life, it was damaged beyond the point where it could be restored to its original condition. But that was okay, because Sarah Martinez wasn't planning to come back to this apartment or this neighborhood or this version of herself. When a mission was complete and Emma was safe, they would start over somewhere new, with new identities and a new life built on the foundation of hard-won security. The people who had threatened her family would never get another chance to hurt anyone, and Emma would grow up knowing that her mother would go to any lengths to protect her. The sun was fully up now, painting the city in shades of gold and orange as normal people prepared for another normal day. They would go to work and school, dealing with ordinary problems and making everyday decisions, never knowing that their safety depended on people like Sarah who were willing to step out of the light and do the hard things that needed to be done. In 12 hours, the criminal organization that had targeted her family would cease to exist. The men who had ordered the attack on a single mother and her 8-year-old daughter would discover that some victims fight back with skills and resources they never imagined. The message would spread through the criminal underworld. There are lines you don't cross, families you don't threaten, and mothers you definitely don't want to make angry. The storm that had provided cover for the previous night's violence was moving out over the ocean, leaving behind clear skies and the promise of a new day. Sarah walked toward her borrowed car with the steady pace of someone who had important work to do, her military bearing evident now that she no longer needed to disguise her true nature. The Navy SEAL was back on active duty, and this mission would not fail. Behind her, the apartment building stood silent and ordinary, giving no hint of the violence that had erupted within its walls or the larger conflict that was about to begin. The neighbors who eventually heard about the break-in would tell the story with increasing embellishment over the years, but none of them would ever learn the full truth about what had happened when 3 criminals made the mistake of threatening a warrior's child. Emma was safe. The threat would be eliminated. Justice would be served. And somewhere in a new city with a new name, a mother and daughter would begin again, protected by the knowledge that some people are willing to fight back against the darkness, no matter what the cost.